I'll redo it. I didn't know how to get back on. Greetings, everyone. My name is Kimberly Dasse, and I'm a consultant at JC Legal. I think we have a few more people who signed up, but hopefully they'll join us. I like to get started on time, so it's the witching hour, so we're going to begin. Today we want to talk about guardianship of minor children, and with a particular focus on the risk of family separation during COVID or other pandemic situations. So one thing I just have to get out of the way first is that nothing in here is legal advice. It's just some information for you. If you have specific concerns, do feel free to contact us. We can help you on a low-cost basis through our virtual legal clinic, or if they're just short questions, we can also address those on a quick pro bono basis, depending on the situation. We're very happy to help, and we like to be involved in the community and the concerns of the community here in Hong Kong. So the things that I want to cover today, I've got kind of a long list of objectives, but don't worry, it won't ruin your lunch too much. We're going to work through these, in a few minutes each. But one thing I want to do first is look at what the parents' concerns are during COVID. We'll look at the relevant government ordinances. There are 2. And then we'll dive into the guardianship aspect of the talk. So look at the nature of a guardianship, what a deed of guardianship looks like. We'll also talk about temporary guardians and what your considerations are for them. And finally, the last 2 points, how to revoke a deed. And probably the one where we may get the most questions is developing strategies for COVID-19 risks. Now, because it's Zoom, I find it tricky sometimes if people jump in, but if you do jump in, feel free to do that. So I might manage that question in a variety of ways, but I definitely want us to aim for interactivity over the internet. So first thing to discuss, what are parents' concerns during COVID? Obviously, what if I test positive? What if my child tests positive? Most of the parents in town have a helper. What if my helper tests positive? And there's 2 things that we have to consider, and we'll discuss these a little bit more when we get to the ordinances, but there's obviously an isolation risk and a quarantine risk. So as I'm sure all of you know, if somebody gets COVID, they're generally going to be isolated at one of the hospitals. And that's obviously done to protect further spread, particularly in Hong Kong where people live so close together. The other risk then would be close contacts of a person who's tested positive, and they would be, generally speaking, isolated, usually at an isolation center. They'd be quarantined, usually at a quarantine center, but sometimes at home, depending on the situation. So the question is, well, what if I, as the parent, test positive? What if it's me who tests positive? Now, I'm going to operate for the moment on the basis that there are 2 parents in that household, that we're talking about an intact married couple. And married is a key word. We'll talk about unmarried situations in a few minutes. But if both parents are in the household, you have a helper and let's say 2 children, the likelihood if one person tests positive, the likelihood is that if one person tests positive, the other partner will be testing positive, and very likely the other members of the household. And so what we have gotten inquiries about, and from people who are quite upset, what if my husband and I test positive and we have to therefore be isolated? Who would take care of our children? And that's where the deed of temporary guardianship can come in. There is a barrister in town who wrote a really interesting article in the South China Morning Post about this. One thing that she said is that, in other jurisdictions, for example, the US and the UK, parents are allowed to isolate or isolate with a sick child, even if the parent has not tested positive. My comment to that is that at this stage, we have observed what's happening in the UK and the US with the pandemic. And I'm not saying it's because of this policy, but Hong Kong has taken a pretty strict stance in really trying to contain it. And we have seen pretty darn good containment within Hong Kong, especially if you compare the data on a like a per 100 person basis. So we have had pretty good control. But for those of you who are parents and people who are parents, it's not very much comfort to say, well, we're doing a good job of controlling the virus, let me take my child from you or take your child. So obviously the concern is that with children, and I'm going to kind of put children in two groups for this conversation. We've got the pre-verbal children who, if they were taken from their parents, I think any therapist or scientist would say that would be a very traumatic event to be ripped from mother's arms and put into an isolation ward without any kind of discussion or understanding of what's happened. Then we have older children, children who are, you know, beyond pre-verbal, who can maybe, you can have a discussion with them and they can better understand what's going on, possibly reduce the impact of that decision to have that child isolated. There is still going to be a lot of risks and difficulties with that. So I completely understand the concerns that parents have. So we're going to operate that on the basis of a situation where we have two parents who have been tested positive and need to isolate, therefore leave the home. So who will take care of their children? And I'm going to operate also on the basis that most of these households have a helper as well. So this is the kind of concern that we're talking about. Now, before we dive into all of those concerns, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page as far as what the authority of the government is and what the relevant ordinances are. And when it comes to COVID and this risk of children being removed from the home, we're talking about two different ordinances. Other things can come into play, but these are the main two ordinances. First is the Prevention and Control of Disease Ordinance, and the second one is the Guardianship of Minors Ordinance. The guardianship is where we talk about deeds of guardianship. Let's look at the PCDO first. And in the PCDO, there's a couple of key points here. First of all, COVID-19 is identified as an infectious disease. They talk about in the ordinance infectious diseases and infectious agents. So once somebody has COVID, that's the infectious disease, but the little virus itself is an infectious agent. Not an important distinction for us, but it is one that is made in the PCDO. The important part of the PCDO for our conversation today is that the health officers who are discussed in the PCDO have a lot of discretion during a situation of pandemic as we have here. The government, through the health officers or other officials, have the ability to seize and test people. And we haven't seen a lot of that. They can seize and test agents and animals and other objects. So if you had not an infectious disease, but an infectious agent in your house or in your workplace, that could be seized and tested, okay? What we're talking about here are ill people, so infectious diseases. The HOs have the ability to direct the isolation, quarantine, and regulation of movement of those infected. And this is really important because it is an arrestable offense if you break quarantine or isolation. The bigger risk, I think, is people breaking quarantine. In the early part of the pandemic, in early April, the first arrest occurred related to this, and it was a businessman who came into Hong Kong, and he was told to quarantine for 2 weeks. We all know that that's been the procedure. And he left quarantine and tried to leave Hong Kong via the Shenzhen border. But because there was a quarantine order associated with him, he was arrested at the border. And interestingly enough, he was given I'm just going to confirm my facts here. He was given a 4-week sentence. The original sentence was 6 weeks, but because he pled guilty, he got a 1/3 reduction, and it was 4 weeks in prison for him. So it's something that the government takes very seriously. The maximum penalty is 6 months in prison and a $25,000 fine. So we have to be very aware that once the government makes decisions about your health status, and if you get a quarantine order or told to isolate in hospital, you need to follow those orders. The authorities are also allowed to trace your contacts, and that's something that you would be expected to cooperate with if you were identified as a positive person. And they can, of course, search your home, your premises, your person as well, and take pictures, and they can also detain people in articles. So the HO has a lot of authority in this situation, and we're going to come back to the HO at the end of this conversation. But I just wanted to make sure that we're all aware of that level of seriousness that's there. I have heard that some people have decided not to even get tested because of these concerns and to isolate themselves at home, etc. If you've got other people at home, you are putting those folks at risk, and you're also potentially denying yourself early treatment that may help reduce the overall effects of COVID. So that's the PCDO. Now we're going to look at the Guardianship of Minors Ordinance, or GMO. As a family law lawyer and a person with some experience in family law, I will tell you that the government/courts are very concerned about always making sure that the best interests of the children are first. So in divorce situations where there are children, making sure that those children are given top priority in terms of their well-being. What do we need to learn about the Guardianship of Minors Ordinance? The Guardianship of Minors Ordinance is generally concerned with a situation where a parent or parents pass away. So they're not generally talking in the ordinance, in the GMO, about this temporary guardian that a lot of people are concerned about. So for the moment, I'm just going to talk about the guardianship in general. First of all, we advise and recommend that parents do consider, as part of their family planning, thinking about having a will, and that in that will there is a provision for your minor children, children under the age of 18, to ensure that they're looked after properly. Nobody is planning on dying. None of us are planning on exiting, but things do happen. And as part of making sure that your children have a proper transition from your care to somebody else's care, it is really important that you plan properly, separate and apart from concerns about COVID. One of the things that you have to think about is, who would you appoint as your guardian? And there's a lot of considerations with this. First of all, this may change over time. So let's say you're 35, you have a great friend, you know, the family friend, Aunt Nancy. Well, you know, hopefully you continue to have a nice long life. Suddenly you're hitting 45. You haven't spoken with Aunt Nancy in a long time. Kids are no longer 2 and 3 years old. They're now 12 and 13. You may need to consider who the appropriate guardians are. So as you're choosing your guardians, just remember that's not a permanent choice. It can change over time. Number one, the guardian has to be willing to accept the appointment. So maybe Aunt Nancy is willing to accept the appointment when your kids are 2 or 3. And even if you keep in touch with her, maybe along the way she's had some health problems, maybe she's had children of her own, who knows? But it's probably something that you should be checking in on with the guardians that you've appointed, so that it is a living and breathing document. It's not something that we just write and we stick it in a drawer and forget about it. Probably every 2 or 3 years, take a look at that deed, see who you've nominated to be guardians, make sure they're okay with it. And as something that comes up with the courts, when your children are an appropriate age, checking in with what their wishes are. The courts will consider their wishes. Now, I'm not suggesting that you ask your 5 or 6-year-old about this, but once your child becomes of more maturity, maybe 10, 11, 12 years old, maybe something to talk about. Some people might be reluctant to have that conversation because they don't want to upset their children, like thinking about, wow, what if mom and dad dies? And that's perfectly normal. So maybe you can make decisions about who those relationships are, the existing relationships with your children and other adults, and see if there's maybe some changes that need to take place. So making sure that the guardian can accept the role. Even if the guardian accepts the role, he or she can later decline. Even if the parents pass away, the guardian can say, this is not for me, I don't want to do this. And then the courts will undertake to find an appropriate guardian.
Kimberly.
Hi, yes.
Hi, it's Rodney. Can I ask a question now, or would you prefer a hold?
Go ahead.
Guardian, I guess the nominee for guardianship, does that considerations for that guardian being in another country versus in Hong Kong? And I guess if it's ideally in another country, are there provisions that you can establish to repatriate your child?
Yes. We can talk about it now. I have a slide on temporary guardian.
Sorry. Okay.
No, it's okay. Don't worry about it. Sometimes you make these slides, but the questions come up in a more natural place. So yes, you can. Let's say we have somebody who's from the U.S. I'm from the U.S. So I'm from the U.S. I can nominate people to be a guardian in the U.S. And if you were to do that, we would advise that you nominate temporary guardians to manage the children while they're in Hong Kong. So, you know, let's say my brother is going to be the guardian of my children in the U.S., but before we're able to repatriate that child or make other decisions about that child, you know, my friend Nancy is gonna look after the children. And we think it's important. We think it's important to have these plans in place in advance, because if there is no one to look after it, then the Hong Kong government will get involved. And you know, I'm not saying that the people who work for the Hong Kong government would do a bad job, but it's more upsetting in an upsetting situation to have to go and then deal with complete strangers. And who knows, the government may wind up identifying my friend Nancy to be the guardians in the end, but there's more confusion. So having a deed that establishes these transitions just provides for lowers your risk of litigation, lowers your risk of confusion as well. And I think that when kids are of an appropriate age, it's also good to talk to them, depending on the situation. Some people really push back on that idea. So thank you for that question. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.
So with the GMO, the triggering event, as we say, would be the death of both parents. So, you know, if one parent survives, obviously that parent is going to be the parent of that child and won't need a guardian. So this is in the event both parents die, then we go into the guardianship. The appointment takes place automatically upon the death of the child. Sorry, upon the death of the parent. So that's why it's important for you to make sure that you are dealing with guardians who are involved with your lives, making sure that they know who they are, and having each other's contact details as well. So what are the elements of a deed of guardianship? I've got those here. You know, the GMO, the Guardianship of Minors Ordinance, and the ordinance I was talking about before, they're both pretty readable. So, you know, if you're thinking about looking at this for yourself as an individual, have a look. Of course, we're happy to help you, and our services are not that expensive for drafting these deeds, but it is something that can be done on one's own. It does have to be a writing. It has to be dated. And there's a couple of points here. It has to either be signed by the person making the appointment or by another person in the presence of the person making the appointment. So with that second part, what I envision is maybe somebody who is severely ill or has suffered a very traumatic injury, and perhaps they can't physically sign the appointment, but they want for a deed to be created, so they can direct that. And very important is that the deed has to be attested to by 2 witnesses. I want to point out here that, so we've got temporary guardians in the mix here, as well as determinative guardians. So there's 2 types, the kind of full-time, we call it determinative guardian, and the folks who would be taking care of the child temporarily. You can appoint more than 1 guardian, okay, as we've already discussed. So, you know, you're living overseas, so your good friend Nancy is going to take care of the children on a temporary basis, but the permanent guardians are back in my home country. You can have a couple of temporaries, a couple of determinatives. You can also identify what the roles and responsibilities are. So through an enduring power of attorney, you could say, well, this guardian is responsible for looking at the finances. The temporary guardians do not have the authority to touch the finances. They would have to be able to get money to support the children from the guardian on a temporary basis. And so that would be a situation where in Hong Kong, if you have decided to set up a deed of temporary guardianship while you and your partner are in the hospital for COVID, which we'll get to in a minute. And it's always stated in all of any forms that you look at or in the law itself for children under the age of 18. So once they reach the age of majority, there's no provision for them. So let's look at temporary guardians. There's 3 points I have here: triggering event, termination event, and also let's look at what the power of the guardian is. We have had some people, and I know other family lawyers have had folks calling up and saying, I want to create a temporary guardianship. Oftentimes people are thinking with my helper as the guardian, in the event I get COVID and my partner gets COVID and we're unable to parent our children. So we're going to look at the powers of the guardians because they're pretty expansive. So in the terms of the temporary guardianship, we can be talking about situations where parents are incapacitated, where parents are, let's say, in a coma, that kind of thing, if you had to be on a ventilator for COVID. But the triggering event needs to be rather clear. So for folks who have done these kind of temporary COVID-related guardianships, the thinking is, well, if I'm admitted to the hospital, that's the triggering event for the temporary guardian to have the power. Problem with that is that if you're corpus mentis in the hospital and you're not on a ventilator, you're not in a coma, you're going to be giving over your parental authorities to somebody while you're still able to make parental decisions. So you need to give a lot of thought as to what the triggering event should be. Perhaps the triggering event should be being put on a ventilator, being in a coma, or other sort of more medical related criteria. Same thing for a termination event. When are the powers of the temporary guardian terminated? Coming out of the coma, being taken off of the ventilator. In other words, for my money, if a parent is still awake and able to make decisions, even if they're pretty sick, I think it's risky to give up your power as a parent. What are the powers of a guardian? Guardians have the power to make all decisions that a parent would otherwise make. So your guardian would be able, or the temporary guardian or the definitive guardian would make decisions as what are they eating, which is okay, that's acceptable, where they go to school, what religion they practice, particularly important legal decisions on behalf of that child. And also very finicky can be medical decisions, including the decision to obtain treatment for your child and the decision not to obtain treatment for your child. And that's where I kind of circle back to what I said earlier. Who is the guardian that you're choosing? You may have a best friend that you really love, but does that best friend share your values? And that's really the proposition here. You know, if you have a friend who thinks, well, you know, I believe that herbs can cure all diseases, that may not be the person that you want to make medical decisions on behalf of your child. Because you can even talk about it with the guardian. Look, if my kid gets sick, this is what I want to have happen. But you don't have any authority over that once you've given up that guardianship, all right? So think about that triggering event if you're thinking about a temporary guardianship for COVID-related purposes. And so that's what I've got here is the authority. The person appointed as the guardian of the minor has parental rights and authority with respect to your to the minor. And we had the question earlier, what about repatriation? Well, they could take that child back to their own home country. They are going to be acting in the feet of the parent while they have that authority. So how is yes?
I'm sorry, Kimberly, I have another question.
Okay.
Does that mean they can also potentially amend permanent guardianship documents?
So could the temporary guardian like remove the definitive guardians?
Yes.
You'd
assume they wouldn't, but I mean, just
I wouldn't imagine that they would. If your wishes are made clear, they could try to do that. There's certainly ways that guardians can ask for changes to be made. There are situations where guardians have had arguments with each other, disagreements about things, and have had to go to the courts. But I can't imagine unless it were for some good cause, right? Let's say that the guardian is, very ill or has a severe alcohol problem or is, in jail, these kinds of things. I think it would have to be pretty serious before they could get removed. But there certainly are provisions in the GMO for guardians to be removed and for guardians to seek to have other guardians removed.
I was just considering the COVID risk. So obviously, if so if they're infected as well and potentially or sadly permanently impacted.
Yeah. So, yeah, but I hadn't really planned for that in this talk, but absolutely, that's a fair question to ask. Absolutely. Yeah, so, the list I read to you: food, clothing, education, shelter, religion, legal matters, medical care, all of those parental decisions are given to the guardian. How is it revoked? How is a guardianship revoked? Now, when we ask this question, the thought in my mind is temporary guardianship, right? Because the deed of guardianship, where we have the definitive guardians, is going to come into effect when a parent passes away, generally speaking. But if the parents are still alive, so in other words, the guardianship has not yet taken place. There's a deed that's been signed. Everyone agrees on it. Everybody knows what their role is and what their responsibilities are. It's not forever. Obviously, it can be revoked. So it's similar to drafting the deed. To revoke the deed, it has to be in writing and attested to by 2 witnesses. The document can be torn up, or if you're unable to tear the document up yourself, you can instruct someone to destroy the document in the person's presence, the person being the person who wrote the deed. So now we're going to talk about strategies for COVID-19 risks. One thing that I would like to highlight is unmarried parental rights in Hong Kong. It may come as a surprise to you all, but unmarried parents in Hong Kong do not have the same rights as married parents. So I do a lot of work with a consultant for JC Legal, Sarah Jane Tester, and she is a French lawyer. She's a registered foreign lawyer. And so we do from time to time work with French clients. And in France, the rights of parents are the same, But Hong Kong is a bit more conservative on this. So unmarried parents do not have the same rights. A mother has full parental rights for her children, but the unmarried father of that child does not have the same rights unless he goes to court and obtains those rights. This is not crucial for the guardianship, because in theory, in the guardianship deed, you are going to say so-and-so is the mother, so-and-so is the father. And then you're going to, work through different scenarios on the basis of the mother and the father, if the mother and father pass away, etc. So it's not a, excuse me, it's not a huge issue, but I like to flag it because I think it should be a consideration if you are living long-term in Hong Kong and you're not married to your partner and you have children. It is even more reason for you to consider having a will, having an enduring power of attorney, and having guardianship for definitive as well as temporary guardians to make sure that your wishes along with your partner's wishes are respected. Another thing is to just go to court and make sure you have the same rights. If you are opposed to getting married, and for some people, that is not the path they want to take. But you have to be aware that in Hong Kong, that carries some risks. So the planning documents, I've mentioned those already. Let's talk about the scenario I created in the beginning where both parents are tested positive and they have to go into isolation. A lot of parents have come to us and said, well, I want my helper to be a temporary guardian for my children. And their reasoning for requesting that makes sense. That helper is probably the only other person, especially if they're living overseas here in Hong Kong, who understands that child's daily needs. Even grandma and grandpas, as much as they love the kids, they may not know that, it can't just be mac and cheese for dinner. It has to be, the star-shaped mac and cheese for dinner in order to make that child happy. So grandparents are great and they can make great guardians. We have to be careful about age and health conditions, but obviously there are very youthful young grandparents out there. But circling back to your helper, one of the concerns that we have with the helper being the guardian is, first of all, if both parents have tested positive, it's very likely that the helper and the children are going to test positive as well. So you may be leaving identifying a temporary guardian who may not be able to fill her duties. The other consideration is a financial consideration. So if you and your husband, or if both parents are in the hospital and incapacitated, if an emergency happens with those children, they may need to be taken to a hospital. There may be school fees that come up. There may be any number of situations where costs are being involved. And most of the time, helpers do not have access to large sums of money. And in fact, I think in most helper situations, the money is controlled pretty tightly with the family. So a helper, what we have heard being done, and I know has been done at least one situation, is that a helper has not been named as a temporary guardian, but the helper has said, I will stay with the children and if necessary, quarantine together with those children or even isolate together if it's possible. We're going to get to that part in a minute. So the helper, you can discuss it with your helper, you can have an agreement with your helper, and then there can be temporary guardians who are outside of the household who can be responsible through an enduring power of attorney. Let's say you have one bank account that you can designate for use by that one or two temporary guardians who will communicate with the helper on what money is needed. And you might want to pick people who would be able also to financially assist in the event that bank account runs dry. So you don't want to leave your helper with that kind of responsibility and not having the resources to fulfill the responsibility. But the helper can certainly be brought in to assist with looking after the children in the event the parents are unable to do so. So those are some of the planning documents. That's some of the considerations with who to choose. I think it's very important to choose a temporary guardian who does not live in your household, because they're going to be unlikely to test positive for the virus. The last thing I want to say in terms of strategies, one thing that we have heard, and in my discussions with the barrister that I talked to on this case, is that if for some reason the health authorities or the HOs are involved in your case, so someone has tested positive, let's say in this instance that it's your child who has tested positive, persuasion is your best tool, okay? Talking to them about what you want, particularly if your child is pre-verbal or, you know, at a vulnerable age, 5, 6, 7 years old, and they would be terrified to be leaving their family home, finding out how you can isolate with your child. There's precedent for this, at least not official precedent for this, but I have heard of it happening here, and it certainly is happening in other jurisdictions. And you know, one thing that you may want to do if you find yourself in this situation is to talk to a family therapist and get information about the trauma that the child faces if they're going to be taken from the home. But what we have been told is that persuasion is going to be one of your best tools if you find yourself in this situation. So you can have the documents planned out. Government does not have to follow what that temporary deed says, all right? So using your persuasive skills to advocate for yourself, that's why you want to also make sure you have temporary guardians who are going to also be able to be good advocates on behalf of your children as well. I think that's everything that I wanted to say on this slide. And this is actually my last slide in the series. Does anybody have any other questions or want to raise any issues on this subject?
Hi, Kimberly.
Hi.
I have a question. Hello. What is the default position if a deed of guardianship is not in place?
It's going to go to the, so if a deed in guardianship is not in place and both parents pass away, the court will be making decisions for those children. So they would get a social worker involved in that situation, and there would very likely a social worker report would be drafted to figure out what to do with children. But I imagine that, you know, there will be people around those children who would be involved and identified.
Typically,
go ahead.
Kimberly, just to extend on Wendy's question, and typically if one does not have family in Hong Kong, but obviously family overseas, that will be the guardian under normal circumstances and does not have a deed in place. I guess from your experience or from what you've seen, does the government consider, how does the government handle that in terms of applications for guardianship from overseas locations?
So if both parents die and they leave, let's say, 2 children here in Hong Kong, 5 and 7 years old, they're going to be put into, you know, a care home while that is sorted out. You have to always go back to the GMO, and the government is always going to do what it believes is in the best interest of those children. So, you know, with the scenario that you've set up, I think repatriation to, you know, grandma or grandpa overseas, or auntie or uncle overseas is probably what's going to be best if there's no one here to care for them. But what I want to say, I want to amend, that's why we suggest having a temporary guardian in Hong Kong, because you want to reduce the risk of trauma to that children. So, you know, in your guardianship deed, you should identify temporary guardians if you're in that situation. And I assume most people who are listening here are probably not Hong Kong people, but they are people who are here in Hong Kong for however long, but they have extended families overseas.
And sorry, if I may ask another question,
Sure.
does the temporary guardian have to be a Hong Kong resident? Do you know?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I wouldn't, so resident, right? Not permanent resident. So they wouldn't have to be a permanent resident. I mean, I suppose, let's say, the answer is, I'm not sure about that. I haven't
That's
been
okay.
asked that before, but I would imagine that in most instances, the person would be a resident because they would be here, most likely working here. And you would want to identify somebody who's living here, right? Because if the scenario that came in my mind was, well, what if my brother's visiting and I die? Well, then they could be a temporary guardian, but I would never appoint them in that way. You certainly wouldn't want to have someone who's here illegally, right? So they're going to be here either as a tourist, as a resident, as a permanent resident, with a few other exceptions out there. I would suggest that you pick someone who's here as a resident or a permanent resident.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Kimberly. Sorry, can I just continue
no,
asking
that's
again? So just the scenario you said where there is no deed of guardianship, the government will take the children and there'll be a social worker working with the children to work out what's the best sort of position for the child thereafter. What if the child says, look, I want to stay with my grandparents. I don't want to go somewhere else. Would the court immediately allow that as opposed to take that assessment? And
look, there's not a ton of cases out there on this, but in my experience with this and talking with other individuals, let's say that child is 12 or 13 years old, right? So a child who knows her own mind and is able to articulate, like you said, I think that tremendous weight would be given to that. Now, let's say there's an accident, the parents are killed, there's going to have to be something done with those children in the 24 hours it's going to take for grandma and grandpa to come and pick them up. I don't think that the government's going to pop them on a plane, back to San Francisco. So there's going to be that gap period. So that's why I think it's good to have that temporary guardian who can help in that transition.
Yep, great. Now the other question, sorry if you don't mind me asking, is you mentioned that the deed of guardianship automatically kicks in when the parents both die. What if they are hospitalized because of COVID? Would the government then say, oh, well, where are the children? Do they actually go to that depth and then ask before enforcing?
Well, I think that the thinking is that in most instances in Hong Kong, there is a helper in the household who can take care of the children. I realize that not everybody has a helper, but I think it's probably 90% of the case particularly for expats living in Hong Kong. If the parents were going to be going into the hospital, they would need to address this with the HO and say, look, my children, we're going into the hospital, what's going to happen to my children? And then placement decisions are going to have to be made. Because it's unlikely that you're going to be put into the hospital sort of on an emergency basis without having a moment to sort of say, hey, wait a minute, what about my kids? I mean, unless your illness was so bad it wasn't diagnosed until you collapsed at work or that kind of thing. But yeah, so that's why it's important to have that temporary guardian there, because let's say you did collapse at work and no one contacted your child, right? And your child comes home from school, there's no helper, that's going to be a really upsetting situation for the child. So definitely have that deed available. And I would even have something in my wallet, that said, in the event of an emergency, please contact this person. Certainly that kind of thing would be checked.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. Anything else?
For those of us that are more anxious now than earlier, how do we get on to next steps, I guess?
Okay,
How do I
first
get
of
a
all,
deed done?
I want to say this.
Yeah.
This talk is not meant to make anyone more anxious, and I'm sorry if that's any
No, I
offense.
appreciate that. It's just my inept care for my child, as I'm sure every parent would be. I didn't take this presentation as that. It's just you know, it's things
Because
I should have
the
considered a
one
while ago.
thing, because I've had folks who have called for inquiries, and they have been on Zoom calls with me, hysterically crying, like really upset. And sort of the logical part of me says, this scenario is really unlikely, right? It's very unlikely. And especially, I mean, I feel really happy. I'm an American. I feel so happy to be living and working in Hong Kong right now because I feel like they're doing a very good job of keeping control. But what are the next steps? You know, if you don't have a will, if you don't have a deed yet, and a deed is very often part of the will, but sometimes people just have a deed. You know, I would say contact a lawyer and talk to them about what your needs are. We're very happy to do that, and you know, we can do things on a low cost basis for the initial inquiry, because I know that these things cost money during a time when people's budgets are getting a little bit hit as well. And you don't have to call us, but you know, there's plenty of folks out there who are willing and happy to help, and certainly we're part of that community. So talk to somebody about what your unique circumstances are and see what works for your family. Anybody else? Well, I really appreciate you guys sharing some of your lunchtime with me, and I hope you found it useful. We're going to be doing other talks throughout September and October, so keep your eyes peeled for those talks, and we hope to see you again on future discussions. And if you need assistance, please let me know or contact somebody else who can meet your needs. I want everyone to feel that they're empowered by what they've learned today to take some active steps. Thank you guys very much.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Kimberly.
Kimberly.
You're
It's been
welcome.
great. Thank you.
Thank you.